Thank you so much, Trevor, and a very good morning to all of you this morning. We extend a hugely warm welcome to you, our attendees, and to our expert presenters, Javita Fazenda of MultiChoice Mozambique and Fatima Ravat of the Ethics Institute. As I said, a very warm welcome to you all. This is the final session of our first Masterclass series that we've held, which has been on codes of ethics. And I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you all a truly productive, fulfilling, and meaningful 2021. I know it's been a challenging time over the past while, and despite this, in many instances, it seems the second round of COVID is in some ways worse than the first, but I believe we've had to learn to do things differently and to think more deeply about the impact of what we do, not only on our world, but on our own lives. So there is, on a community level, I think, still so much to be hopeful for and positive about. To those that weren't able to join us for the first two sessions, please do make contact with us. We have the recordings available and we would be happy to pass these on to you. To those of you who are joining for the first time, we hope that you will find the session useful. And again, the first two sessions are available via recordings, which I think you will find very valuable. In our first session on the 19th of November, we launched the Portuguese version of the Code of Ethics Handbook. This is an excellent resource. And if you are somebody who's involved in ensuring that a Code of Ethics becomes a significant and dynamic document in your organization, then the handbook will be a very useful tool for you. It's available on the coalition website, which is coi.org.nz, along with some other very useful resources for you. This session today wraps up an excellent three-part series. The first session introduced the concept of a code of ethics and the context within the ethics management framework. Then the second session looked at the process of developing a code of ethics. And today's session will then take us through the very important process of taking what we've had and implementing it in the organization and making it something which becomes the heartbeat of the organization's values and daily operations, in fact. And so it is my very great pleasure to hand you over to our Masterclass experts, Javita Fazenda of MultiChoice Mozambique and Fatima Ravat of the Ethics Institute. So today what we will do is, the first session will just be a quick recap, which Fatima will handle on what we've done in the first two sessions. Then we will get into the nitty-gritty of the implementation. So by 11:30, we will have round about 5 minutes, depending on the timing, to take questions from you. The same process for session 2 and then session 3. And then we hope to wrap up sharply at 12:30. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Fatima. And Fatima will take us through the introduction with the two sessions from last year, and then take us into our implementation program. Thank you, Fatima.
Great, thank you, Barbara, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. So as Barbara said, what we'll start off by doing is doing a recap of what we've covered in the first two sessions. So in the first session, we started off by looking at what do we mean by ethics? And we use this triangle as a frame of reference for our understanding of ethics. And we say ethics in its simplest form is about drawing a balance between what is good both for the self and for the other. And in the concept of organizations, the self is the organization, the other are your stakeholders, both internal and external. And when we talk about the notion of good, it's about what is good, what is lawful, what is right, etc. And when we think of a concept of a code of ethics, what the code of ethics does is it codifies or it represents what good looks like in the context of your organization, and it articulates that out to your stakeholders, both internally and externally. And we also introduced in the first session the ethics management framework, which was developed by the Ethics Institute. And the essence of the ethics management framework is about understanding how does one impact on the ethical culture within the organization. And we define culture as the way we do things in our organization. And we discussed that in order to impact on culture, you need a couple of things to happen. So you need leadership commitment, which is shown at the top. You need to have appropriate governance structures in place that would exercise oversight over, are we building an ethical culture within our organization? And then in the heart of the ethics management framework sits the management of ethics. And we also discussed that one cannot manage ethics without first understanding what's really going on in your organization. And so as you look within the greens that surround the picture, what the ethics management framework guides us is that first what you would do is conduct an ethics risk assessment. And we spent some time in the first session talking about what an ethics risk assessment is. And once you get an understanding of an ethics risk assessment, it gives you an ethics risk profile report. Based on that, you would develop an ethics strategy, and that strategy would be your strategic document that would guide you in terms of what are we going to do based on what we understand our risks to be to move forward to be an ethical organization. And that's where our code and ethics of ethics then fits in. Once we have our ethics strategy, we have a sufficient understanding of our risks and our strategic vision to be able to develop our code of ethics, which is about the sort of organization we want to be and what does good look like. And then we accompany it by ethics-related policies that support our ethics code. We then talked about the fact that once we have that stock take of our reality and a strategic direction, are we in a position to go off and make ethics real within our organizations? And that's what institutionalization is about. But we have a solid base on which we've moved. And then we talked about monitoring and reporting. So essentially, we spent a little bit of time in the first session framing this because it's important to understand that framework. And for today's discussion, when Javita shares that practical experience, it's also useful to have this framework in mind. We also quickly in our first session talked about how fundamental it is that when we talk about conceptualizing or drafting a code of ethics, that we keep at the core of what we do, whether we are drafters or whether we are implementers or whether we are decision makers, that we understand fundamentally what is the purpose of the code. Why are we doing this and what should the code do for the organization? And the answer to this question will define everything else that we do. So it's almost critical that even as you sit, that you need to ask yourself that question and write it down and constantly go back and refine that so that everyone who is thinking with that with you comes to a common understanding of what is the purpose and what do you want to achieve with the code. And in having that discussion around purpose, we also talked about the difference between a code that is drafted in a compliance mode, which is aimed at the curbing of negative ethics risk. So generally like your codes of conduct, or something that's aimed at building a more integrity mode document, which is around ethical culture. And so the differences of the two sit on quite a wide spectrum. And it's important for you, whether you're a drafter, a decision maker, an advocate, that you understand where on that spectrum does the code sit, because it enables that understanding to then be filtered down to others in the organization. We also then spent a lot of time talking in the second session about how does then one go about drafting a code. Once you have that answer to what purpose is, it will inform everything else that you do. And the steps in drafting then become design. How are we going to arrive at the document we want to have? What is the level of consultation? Who's going to be part of the process? Who needs to understand it? How are we going to launch it? Then what is the format? What is this document going to be looking like? What is the structure of the document? Is it going to be talking about risks? Is it going to talk about values? How are we going to frame the document? And then what is the tone? Are we going to use a harsh, thou shalt not language? Are we going to use a language that is more enabling, that is more all-encompassing? So the answers to these questions, we talked a lot in our second session because they're quite critical to you as drafters to keep in mind. And we also then shared with you a bit of a template to consider when you're drafting a process in terms of how you would focus around your code design. What are the key things and how important it is for you to have leadership commitment right at the outset, because that leadership commitment is important for you to understand your risks, because your code must have that information in mind, for you to embark on a process of drafting, to get approval, and then to go off and make the code real within your organization. So that was, in summary, what we covered in the first two sessions. I just want to pause to check in with Jovita, if you'd like to add anything in terms of what we covered on the first two sessions.
No, Fatima, I think you've covered it well. The rest was giving examples more or less on how it happens in practice. But I think you've covered it very well.
Okay, great. Thanks. Barbara, can I move on to the primary implementation?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, when we think about the concept of implementation from a theoretical point of view, in the language of ethics, we make a distinction between what we call primary implementation of the code of ethics and the secondary implementation of the code of ethics. And for you who sit within your ethics office, or you think about making things real in terms of ethics in your organization, it's useful to make that distinction. So what do we mean when we talk about the primary implementation? So if you think about your code of ethics, when we talk the language of primary implementation, what we're actually talking about is how your codes of ethics could be implemented as documents in their own right. How are you going to make this code of ethics real? So you literally have to lift those words off the paper and start making it become a lived reality within your organization. Otherwise, it's a pointless exercise. And if you think about the whole aim of the ethics management framework, is you want to be able to have an impact on the ethical culture within your organization. So what are you going to do? And if you look at the Code of Ethics Handbook, what it does is it categorizes primary implementation into the following subcomponents. So it emphasizes first and foremost the importance of branding. And especially those of you that sit in a corporate context, or even if you sit in a public sector context, the aim of branding is you want it to be a recognized document. What makes it specific? What makes it unique that it can be something that is recognized? And I'll just give you the theory, and Jovita can talk a bit more about the experience. Then you want to have a significant moment around launching the code. And the idea of branding and the idea of launching is that it has to be significant moments or milestones that employees in the organization are able to identify with. They're able to remember it, they're able to relate to it, and it marks a milestone in your journey as an organization. So the more they can relate to it, the easier it becomes that it becomes imbibed in their minds. So think practically about your context, about your budget, use technology to your advantage, but try to be quite innovative so that people are able to associate these memories with a marked milestone around your code. Then it's really important as part of your primary implementation that you get shared commitment. And so often symbolic gestures are very significant, whether you print a big copy and you get people to do fingerprints, or you put it in your foyer, but you want your code of ethics, because it's about our organization, to not just be about leadership, because leadership voice is important, but you need commitment from everyone in the organization. And so the question for you from a primary implementation point of view is, how do we obtain shared commitment from everyone who makes up part of our organization? And then most significant, after you've done all of this, is that awareness creation is not a once-off exercise. You need to have continuous efforts around creating awareness around this code of ethics. What is it? What does it mean? How does it affect you? What does it mean for our values? What does it mean for our work? How does it affect you in the specific aspect of the work that you do within the organization? And the more we make it real, the more we do this continuously, the more significant its impact would be. Jovita, I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Fatima. I think that in terms of this first part of the first implementation, in terms of practical examples, I think that first, your code of ethics needs to be a user-friendly document. So if you are going to have a code of ethics we've discussed, don't have something that it's cumbersome to read, it's cumbersome to be understood by by your staff, and also doesn't call their attention. So it needs, the whole branding idea needs to be something that marks it as a document, a go-to document where people easily find guidance and find information as they go along their work. In terms of the code launch, I'll use an example as marking steps in our lives. It's like when we celebrate weddings or christening or anything, we make an event and people remember that event and they remember what is related to. So your code launch has to be like that. So people need to have that moment where they participate on the launch. And it's very important because this is a process. Remember, you had a risk assessment where you involved your staff. You had the whole exercise to come up with the code. You involved the staff and they participated. So they need to kind of celebrate the product of all that work. And this also brings the acceptance of the new code because they know they actively participated on it. So make it an event, make it preferably, if you can, mark the period before the launch with certain activities, certain teasers, things that will bring up the interest on the launch of the code, and knowing that there's a product to all the exercise that we've been through this time, where there was a risk assessment, there was the surveys and all of that. I think that the shared commitment, it comes first from the leadership. The launch and everything needs to be the leadership needs to be very active on this process. And the commitment is something that we start gaining with the process, and the launch of the code is the culminating of that commitment in terms that we've produced this together, now let's make it real. And to make it real, you need people to acknowledge that now we have a code and we want this to go forward. All this effort that we've done through this time on assessing our risks, our opportunities, and then drafting this code that will make us look as we want. Like Fatima said, the code is what good looks like in this environment that we're in, being an institution, being your own business. So this commitment needs to exist, and it needs to be symbolic. You should create some kind of symbolic commitment taken by people. Like Fatima said, either fingerprints or the signing of the code, something that creates this commitment. I think one of the things that is very interesting to do in terms of marketing image is, if you can, for example, create pins that staff will wear, small things like the mouse pads and things like that that are there and mark that launch and mark that commitment. That is always a reminder when people have something to look at that takes them back to that moment and takes them back to the understanding that there is a code. We have discussions about it, we spoke about it. The ongoing awareness is your key. After all this, because this is all events, your ongoing awareness is now that making it live every day. So having campaigns around the code of ethics, having reminders, be it through emails, be it through meetings and conversations, and having posters, but things that kind of take your staff back to the code and take them back to the reflections that you have now brought into a code. So what good looks like needs to be constantly reminded so that it then becomes the way of living of the institution. So you need to design a plan in terms of how am I going to communicate my code from now on. And it's very important to transform the code from just phrases written to everyday experiences. And then that's where your interaction with the other areas will come in, where you make it more realistic in terms of this is how our code applies to your day-to-day work. So the ongoing awareness is then your continuous job in terms of not letting the code be just a document that had the launch one day and then went into a went into the walls, and then nobody understands why we're saying that we are, for example, honest. What does it mean here? So the ongoing awareness is what explains that, what it means for the company to have a code of ethics, what the values that are there mean, and how are they applied on the day-to-day. So I think that it's very important to explain also that all of this looks very good, and it's not an easy exercise. There's always, depending on the environment and the culture of the institutions that you're working on, there's some level of skepticism. And this can be small groups, or it can be wide skepticism. From my experience, I've worked at companies that the culture was very on the other side, or at least the perception of people was that the culture was very poor. So coming with this exercise and launching a code of ethics for people was like, oh, okay, we've seen this happening, and well, we know how it's going to go. That's not how things are done here. So it happens that you can find this skepticism, and you can find also a group that pushes back because they don't have an interest on changing how things are done in the company. So be ready for that, and be ready to kind of find creative ways to first deal with the skepticism, whereas conquer more and more people that believe the process. And second, in terms of pushing what we call the bad apples either out or transforming them, which can be more difficult, but at least starting to bring some belief in the process. Trust me that you will be seen as a police from time to time, because people will think that ethics is there to, or ethics or compliance is there to punish, is there to find us doing the wrong thing. So this is a work in progress, and ethics officers and compliance officers need to have this understanding and be able to change the conversation, change their tones, their tone to conquer more and more people and their belief on their work.
Thank you so much, Fatima. I'm going to take some questions now. We're slightly ahead of time, but that's an excellent input. I just wanted to know if there is anybody who has questions. Would you put your questions in the Q&A? While you do that, I just wanted to ask both Fatima and Javita. You mentioned the worst case scenario. Now let's hope that none of the organizations that are participating have this issue, but what if your leadership is negative? How do you get them on board?
Do you want me to go first, Javita?
Yes, whoever would like to.
Okay. In the work that we do, and if we take us back to the ethics management framework, you would notice that the leadership commitment is absolutely critical, and it appears in the framework as the first block. And it's very critical that before you embark on an exercise of this nature, that you invest the time and the energy and the resources necessary in obtaining that leadership commitment. Otherwise, the exercise in everything else that you're going to do is almost going to be a superfluous exercise. I mean, our CEO, Professor Rousseau, often says something like, it's about the tone at the top, the mood in the middle, and the groundswell at the bottom. But that tone at the top is so critical. And if you don't have that willingness, if leadership does not understand what an ethics journey looks like, if leadership is not committed to embarking on that journey, if leadership is not willing to understand that what we're trying to do is impact on culture, what is culture, and that we are going to embark on an exercise where we are going to do a risk assessment, there are things that are going to come out that we may not like to hear. That may not make us look good in this process, but it's okay. We're willing to do. If you don't have that commitment, then the exercise of doing your code of ethics is a paper exercise, and you are going to lose a lot of faith and credibility amongst your staff. or your employees or your stakeholders. So it's absolutely important that if one plans to navigate a journey of this nature, that you give it the time and the resources and the energy it deserves in that context, because everybody's context is different, to ensure that you firstly invest in securing leadership commitment, however that context requires. So it could be board, and then social and ethics committee, and then exco, and then middle management, and then junior management, before you even start, hypothetically. But
Okay.
whatever that requires, it's important to do that investment. Jovita?
Okay. So yeah, I totally agree with Fatima, but one of the things that I want to call the attention is in terms of having leadership, sometimes leadership says, yes, we want to do this because they kind of see some value in it, but they don't know how it's applicable in reality, and they're also skeptic. So I think that one of the things that ethics officer, compliance officer need to understand is there's no such thing as being a compliance officer or an ethics officer of an industry that you don't understand. So you don't need to know the nitty-gritties of the commercial and how the commercial strategy is made, but you need to understand the industry. You need to understand what makes money for that industry. And when I say this, is because when you speak to your leadership, you need to explain to them why doing it better has more results in the long term commercially. If you can't tie the exercise that you're making to sustainability of the company in terms of returns, in terms of achieving the goals, then you will start a battle that you can't win, because your leadership needs to understand that you are commercially oriented. And I use the term commercially oriented because I had this experience at Vodacom where I started at Vodacom and I had my first year and I was a star because there were a lot of problems. So it was easy to be a star employee. And then the second year, my top boss, which I have to say has been one of the best leaders I've had in life, Jerry Mobbs, he told me on my evaluation that I wasn't commercially oriented because I had become the police. I had become the person that says no, but also does not have an alternative. And then from that, I was so shocked that I then started to see how I could change. And when I learned the business a bit more, it was so much easier. And it was incredible how from then on, when I started understanding the business better and I could come with an option of a solution, it started happening the opposite, where something would happen and he would come to my table and say, what do you think about this? Because he could see that I could think outside of the box. My job was not just to say no, was to say, not this way. Let's try it this way. It may take longer, but the risks are this for the shorter routes that we're trying to take. Yes, it brings results earlier, but then this can happen. So in a way, it's very important to understand the industry. So any ethics or compliance officer needs to really understand where they're working, understands the areas, kind of have an holistic understanding of what happens around the business, what are the processes. And that helps you because when you have the conversations with the leadership, you're able to transform the rules or the values into specifics, and then they understand you, and then they get on board with you.
That's excellent input. Yes, Fatima.
Maybe just to add on the back of what Jovita is saying, in those leadership commitment engagements, it's also useful to understand the industry you're in. So your peers, your other players in that market. And perhaps if there have been incidences or instances where they have had, issues or crashes or ethical downfalls, to be able to talk about those, because that's how we learn. And often, sometimes we almost instinctively want to say, why should we be ethical? But sometimes to flip the question and say, what is the cost of being unethical? What is the risk of being unethical, and what does that mean? And to display that by looking at the experiences of others, Enron, etc., 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 is a very useful conversation strategically to have at a leadership level, depending on where you're targeting it, because it often is more impactful and linking up to what Jovita is talking from a commercial perspective. You're not talking the language of money, but they translate it into the language of money. And in terms of impact and getting the message through, that's perhaps one other thing to throw in for consideration.
Great. Well, that's excellent input. And I think just a thought I've had, which I'm putting out to you, the participants, is if you feel that we could dedicate a session to specifically how to get leadership on board, if you're in a difficult position, please do put your comments into the chat or into the Q&A. So with that, we go on to the secondary implementation. Over to you, Fatima.
Sure. Okay, so now when we talk about secondary implementation, oops. So when we talk about secondary implementation, so in our ethics journey, our code of ethics is one ethics management instrument. It is part of a number or a suite of other ethics management interventions that we have in place. So when we think about secondary implementation, by now our code has been launched, it's been branded, it's been accepted within our organization. Now, how do we integrate it or use it in conjunction with other ethics management intervention? It's also part of the institutionalization. It's part of making it real. And the closer you get to tying it in to what you're doing, the more resonance it has, the more people are able to relate to it. And as the custodian of ethics, it's very important that you ensure that in constant integration, so that the code doesn't sit in isolation, that it's continuously used in conjunction with other ethics management initiatives. Because remember that we think of the code as a constitution. So that constitution needs to now be lived. So there are different areas or aspects that you would be able to use it. These are illustrative examples that we've put for you, but they're more than that. And between Jovita and I will try to share that with you. So first and foremost, it's about ensuring that as part of your ethics awareness initiatives, that you make reference to your code. That with every opportunity that you get, even if you're talking about an ethics policy, that you start making reference to the code of ethics. So it's not seen in isolation, that everything you do, that there's a constant anchoring almost, if you like, within your code of ethics. Then our ethics induction, our employee induction programs provide such a wonderful opportunity for new people who come into our organization to understand who we are, what we're about, and what does good look like. And in many organizations, we're not sufficiently using those induction programs as an opportunity to enhance our ethics programs. So let's engage with HR, let's take stock of what we're doing, let's see what are the opportunities that we can include the ethics elements around our code of ethics, our ethics related policies within the employee induction programs, whether it's about making copies, whether it's about giving ethics a slot, whatever it looks like, so that it's integrated, it's part of what we do. And try to find those opportunities and explore it. Then having ethics training is very critical. So as ethics officers have a plan for what is our ethics training, and your ethics risk assessment gives you a really nice picture of what are the issues, what are the risks, and use your ethics risk assessment outcomes as a basis for your ethics training plan. What are the areas, what are the units we might need to focus on, what are the areas of concern. Your risk assessment would also show you what your levels of awareness are. So use that as an opportunity to inform what you're going to do. Now, very critical, and we often find this in our ethics risk assessment, is we have these really wonderful documents and really wonderful policies, but the implementation is going to sit at line management level. And that, what is the level of utilization? Do our line managers understand? What does it mean? What does it mean in terms of how they implement it in their work? Whether you're doing a performance assessment, whether you're doing a performance review, whether you're having a coaching conversation, whether you're issuing you're having a disciplinary conversation. How are we making that real from a line management perspective? And often we find from an ethics risk perspective point of view that our managers may be really great engineers or really great attorneys or really great accountants, but that they're not so great in terms of their soft skills in managing people. And so taking that code of ethics and making it part of how we manage, so that the utilization by management, because that's how employees experience us, is so critical. And then another element of secondary implementation is also, so beyond our staff or our employees, we have a range of other stakeholders, like we have our suppliers, or we could have other government agencies or peers. And are we sufficiently using opportunities to orientate those who engage with us about who we are from an ethics perspective? What do we stand for? What do we mean? What does it mean to ethically engage with us? So for example, perhaps if you have, you can do training for your suppliers on what it means to be an ethically aware supplier. And currently, the Ethics Institute, in conjunction with Siemens, is rolling out a program called the Ethically Aware Supplier Initiative, where we are working with organizations, and Celia can share more about that, where we do ethically aware supplier training. And you can almost make it a precondition. Before you get onto my database, you are pre-qualified because you have gone through this training and you do it ever so often. Or if you're going to bid for work, it's part of a declaration. So what are those opportunities that you have to orientate your stakeholders to who you are? Again, you are making your code real and making others aware of who you are and what you stand for. And often in our organizations, we spend a lot of our time thinking about what goes wrong, but are we sufficiently spending time on what's working? Where the code is being adhered to, where things are working well, let's find those opportunities to recognize it, to applaud it, because when we do that, we also, once again, are emphasizing the importance of what's working, re-emphasizing the value of the code. When we also think about it from a secondary implementation point of view, when we talk about our ethics-related policies, and ethics-related policies could be your core policies and your non-core policies. When you talk about those policies, it's so critical that you always show the link between your code of ethics and those ethics-related policies. So you're continuously making that connection. People are not seeing things in isolation. They're able to appreciate the bigger picture and how things connect. And when you do that as the ethics officer, the more sense you make of it, the more you can make it real, the more people are able to make that real in terms of the work that they do within the organization. And one other last area around secondary implementation is also then making it part of your disciplinary processes, so that we not, your code of conduct regulates your disciplinary process, but your code of ethics, certainly you're able to say, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, this is the sort of organization we're about. So ultimately, secondary implementation in its various aspects, and we're sharing some ideas with you now, is how you use your code of ethics in conjunction with other ethics management initiatives, so that you're working towards that bigger goal of institutionalization, with the ultimate goal of influencing or impacting on ethical culture in your organization. Javita, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Fatima. I think that one of the first things I will go back to what Fatima said in the beginning, that our code of ethics is what good looks like in the company. So one of the first things that we need to do or learn how to do is how to translate everything that happens in the company into the values that we now have declared as our values. So what does this mean? Your code of ethics is a tool for decision making. So it needs to feed into every decision that you make. It should actually be a standard that you measure your decisions against. When you take a decision, you should always have in mind if you're living up to those values that you've now put on your code of ethics that is your constitution as a company. So like Fatima said, I think that's one of the things first is aligning this with other policies. So your values, your policies need to live up to your values. Whatever rule you create in a code of conduct, for example, needs to be a rule that you created to protect one of your values. So when you explain to your staff or anyone, you need to make this connection. And if you can't make this connection, something is wrong. There shouldn't be a disconnection between your values and the rules that you apply in your company and the decisions that you take in your company. So it's very important that you make this exercise of translating your other policies or your values and having a match between them and your other policies and the way you do your business and the way you interact with other parties. The ethics awareness initiatives, as we had started talking before, you need to have them regularly, you need to have communications about it, but every once in a while, you need to celebrate your code of ethics, you need to celebrate the people that are living up to your code of ethics, you need to make it live, you need to always celebrate what is good in your company so that people be reminded that this is the way we want to go. It's very important that when you hire new staff, you have an induction. They need to understand who you are as a company. They need to understand what is expected of them, what is the culture, and what is good at the company, because they need to come into the environment already understanding what are we aiming to achieve, where do we want to go. It can't be the opposite, where they get into the environment and then after a month or so, or 3 months, we then take them up and say, now we want to tell you who we are. It needs to be the opposite. They need to come in with the right mindset. And having said this, it's important that your HR understands your ethics and your code, because they're the first part of the recruitment process. They are the ones who participate in the selection of those people that you now are making an induction of. So they need to also incorporate in the recruitment process your values and look for people that live up to those values and people that do understand or at least show potential of merging into the culture that you're trying to create. It's necessary also after induction. It's not once off induction and then people go on and their lives go on no matter how many years they stay in the company. It needs to be a continuous training. So you need to have ethics training, ongoing ethics training. Then that's a decision from the business, how you want to do this. If you want to do it every year, if you want to do every month. But then this also comes to understanding which are your more risky areas. And you also should tailor the trainings to areas that are more at risk, to attend their own questions and doubts in relation to your code of ethics. Line management. The line management utilization of the code is very important. We talk a lot about the top commitment tone from the top. This is very important and it's key. But on the day-to-day, there's an influence that is very strong, and this is direct management influence. Your middle level management needs to understand your code, because they are the ones that on the day-to-day manage the staff. They are the ones that actually transmit to the staff what the goals are. And the person that transmits to the staff what is expected of them needs to tell them not only what they are to achieve, but how they are to achieve. And the how is the code of ethics. Is yes, we want you to achieve sales in this number. However, there are rules to how you achieve it. We're not just going to evaluate the number at the end. We're going to evaluate what you've done, how you got there, because the how is important in the culture that we're trying to create. Have due attention. When we decide what we want to be, how good we want to be, we can't forget our supply chain. Our supply chain is an integral part of our business. So it's very important that your supply chain understands how you want to be known, because you can't say that you want to be known as a company that preserves the environment, and then on your supply chain, you have a supplier that does exactly the opposite and you use his products. You continue to finance his business, because then you actually having an imbalance between what you said you are and what you're promoting. So it's important that your supply chain also understands your code of ethics, also understands who you are as a company and where you want to go, what the culture is. And they need to be in tune with it. They need to be promoting more or less the same things as you, because otherwise one is not talking to the other, and you actually, your staff and everybody that sees this will see that there's a discrepancy here, and realistically we're not this that we're trying to show to the world that we are. I've spoken about the recognition, as Fatima had spoken, and I'm now going to speak about, again, HR. HR is a great piece on this because they deal with staff on a daily basis. And our promoters and our ambassadors at the end of the day is our staff. Our staff are the ones that have to take the code of ethics as dear. And they need to feel that it applies to them, it protects them. And when I say this, it protects them both ways in terms of how the business deals with them and also how they take their decisions on the day-to-day. They need to understand, for example, when you have a policy of conflicts of interest, that you're not trying to intrude into their lives, you're actually telling them, as transparent as you are about your other interests, your other financial interests, your other friends' interests, if you are on a recruitment, you're actually protecting yourself from, if it's found out later that there was a potential conflict, that there was no bad faith on your side, that you actually were transparent about it, and you said, but listen, I have a company that does cleaning, and then one day that company gets hired by some other department that it's not yours, but you had declared it. And sometimes you didn't even know, but then if nobody knew that there was a connection, all questions come. But then if the business had the chance to kind of manage that potential conflict, and everybody clearly knows how the selection was done, how all the management of the situation was done, and then there are no questions. So it's very important that we all, at all levels, there's an understanding, and we work on creating that understanding. We do the connections, and we have the conversations with the departments, and we keep those conversations open, and the adapting of the policies and of the processes is done, always having the code of ethics as the standard that we have compromised in the beginning to achieve. So everything else needs to promote the standards. Barbara?
Great, thank you so much, Fatima. Javita, sorry. I am very much interested in the issue of getting the middle management, because we know those are the sort of foot soldiers. And I think that's a critical point. We have a question from David. How do we involve other stakeholders in this process, purpose and implementation of our code of ethics, sharing with them our good practices in terms of ethical leadership? So just both of you can make an input on that. How do you involve other stakeholders in the process of developing, you know, the first two things that we said? What is the purpose of the code of ethics? And then implementing it and sharing with them good practice. Would you like to start, Fatima? Thank you.
So one of the ways in which you can involve your stakeholders is during your ethics risk assessment process. Some organizations opt only to engage with their staff, with their internal stakeholders. Other organizations, especially those who engage a lot with external stakeholders, opt during their risk assessment process, opt to also engage with external stakeholders to understand you know, the impact that they have, what is their stakeholder expectations, what are some of the risks. So from the word get-go, they're engaging the external stakeholders in that process, and that often tends to be quite a useful process. So there are two ways in an ethics risk assessment that you can engage external stakeholders: in the qualitative process, where you engage with them and you understand by conversing, what does it look like, what are the risks, And then another element to deepen that is that when you distribute your ethics risk survey, you also may identify select stakeholders that you get to complete the survey, so you get that angle. So there's merit in that, and not all organizations do it. Sometimes it's a budget issue, but there is that one opportunity. So that gives you an idea of what are their expectations, what may have been some of the experiences, what may some of the threats be. And then another opportunity that I know about is then once you do your code. So if I can use an example, in the supply chain process, when you issue out your tenders and you have your bid documents that suppliers are meant to complete, and generally those documents are quite business or financial orientated. They ask you about conflicts of interest, but some organizations are now opting where they get their suppliers as part of their bid submission process that they have to sign a declaration to engage ethically. And in that declaration, it says, this is our code of ethics, this is what we stand for, and that you are committing that you are not going to be unethical in your dealings with us. So it's also a way of, it's relevant to the stakeholder that you're going to work with us, but it's bringing the code of ethics into sort of that one pager. So it creates awareness around that. Jovita, do you have things to share?
Just adding up to what Fatima said, I think that a lot of companies do, when they launch their tenders, they do sessions of Q&As, for example, in terms of clarifying the tender document. This is more on the private sector. That's a great opportunity to kind of share your ethics. Other than, like Fatima said, when you send your tender documents and everything, you should have already there a statement of how you deal, what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do with us, and this our standards. But also in those Q&A sessions, it's a very important point to pass out the conversation. In terms of budgets and in terms of financing this engagements with because you can also organize at Vodacom. What we had was yearly. There's a supplier forum where most suppliers, at least at a certain level, are invited, and where we share this, we share the plans for the year. If there's any initiatives to empower new suppliers in terms of giving them training about ethics, because Vodacom does a lot of that. That's empowerment of small companies in terms of giving them the tools to kind of bring them to a level where they can be on the supply chain. So during all those sessions, it's possible. And I think that one of the arguments that an ethics department can use is the cost of not doing it. Again, understanding how the business works. Procurement is a very risk area for any ethics efforts, any anti-corruption, anti-bribery effort. And it's very important to kind of share with leadership the fact that speaking to your suppliers will save you money, because unfortunately, if you live in a space where there's a culture of paying kickbacks to get contracts, those 10% that are added to the contract, which you as a company will pay at the end, are far less than having financing a session with your suppliers before, in terms of creating awareness of, this is who we are, we don't accept this, kickbacks are not allowed, these are the channels that we have for you to report any request of kickbacks, these are our procedures. So investing in creating this awareness costs less to the business in the long term. So again, this comes to understanding your industry, understanding where you're working, understanding your market. So if you know that there are some practices that are more costly to the company, you take it from there and you have an argument to convince your leadership that it's more important to have forums with our suppliers than just letting it slide, because in the long run, we lose far more.
Thank you for that input. And Fatima, I'll take your discussion and then make some comments.
Okay, one other thing I wanted to add, and Jovita's input reminded me of it, is we mustn't forget the value of our reporting mechanisms. So our annual report or sustainability report, or however you may call it in your context. An increasingly good practice is that you use that as an opportunity to report on your ethics infrastructure. So it's a way of saying, and if you look at the good governance reporting principles, it advocates for that, where it says that you report to say, as part of your report, we have a social and ethics committee, we have an ethics office, we're doing this, we've developed our code, maybe even putting the code, the elements of it up front or something like that, but integrating it into your annual report or your sustainability report is also a way of communicating to other stakeholders, where you're saying, because it shows what are we doing from an ethical leadership perspective. It shows what is our ethics infrastructure. It shows who we are as an organization and what we stand for and what. So even if you're putting it in, you have a section dedicated to ethics, but then it also becomes part of what you're doing. It's also that way, which I think David's question was asking about sharing. And then one other thing I wanted to share is that from a sharing perspective, I see in some industries, they have peer learning groups, where they have peers who come together to share and learn, and they use opportunity to then talk about, where they have business forums, etc., where they can potentially also use that as an opportunity to talk about the challenges in our industry around ethical leadership, and then how do we navigate those. So perhaps just to add those, Barbara.
Yes, thank you so much, Fatima. And I think what's important about your point in terms of reporting in the annual report is that it also enforces a level of accountability, so that, and it builds so much trust in the organization in a positive sense. And, if you've put it out there in the public, this is the way we do things, it's very often the way things get done, because people will take you up on that and will remember that. I don't see any other questions. Oh, another one, how to act when your own human resources people are the ones who violate the principles of the ethics, the code of ethics. For example, in the recruitment process. I think this is such a good question because it is so common.
Mm.
Yeah, who would like to take that?
Jovita can take the how to act. I can take, I can provide a bit of an input from an ethics perspective. So when we think about our ethics, I'm sorry about my background noise. When we think about our ethics infrastructure within our organizations, am I audible, Barbara?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
We strongly suggest to organizations the establishment of something called an ethics working group. Now, an ethics working group becomes an operational working group, which is headed by your ethics champion, and input is made by the ethics office. And what you would do is you would get the heads of the different aspects of your organization. So you'd get HR, you'd get legal, you'd get COO, communications, etc., all the different components of your business. And we sit together in the ethics working group, and the ethics office engages with it, because ethics is everybody's business. So let's talk about ethics. What does this mean? We did this strategy. What does it mean in your work? Because the strategy is accompanied by an implementation plan. So it's not the ethics office's business, because recruitment, if HR is not going to do pre-employment screening and vetting, it's a risk. If we're not going to do this, it's a risk. So the more we talk about it and we create that awareness, and then people go back to their spaces and they make it real. So we're not taking over HR's job. But certainly we putting the limelight on it to say, when you don't do that, the way we said you should, or the way we agreed, it exposes us. So that conversation is an important one, and it's a good idea for organizations to have an ethics working group, which is operational. It's not a governance one. It meets once a quarter. It has these discussions, and people go back to their spaces and make ethics real. It has a lot of impact in terms of the sustainability of the business and the sustainability of the ethics program. Jovita?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the how, one of the things I have to remind, when we compromise to an ethics code, it becomes a constitution. And the idea around the constitution is nobody's above it. So if nobody's above it, everybody needs to, they've compromised, they need to act accordingly. So your HR, your top leadership, everybody needs to act accordingly. So if HR is it a person, is it a whole department is acting in a way that is unethical, all the same procedures that applies to everyone are applicable to HR. So reporting of unethical misbehaving, having due process, and all of that needs to apply. So my point here is to say that whatever happens, even if it's HR, if it's unethical, it needs to be reported, either internally reported or reported in any other channel that may exist outside to report. And all the rules of reporting needs to apply to it. If the person is not comfortable in reporting openly, needs to have anonymous means of reporting, needs to have the protection of any whistleblower and all of that. So it's a work that affects the whole of the company. So HR is part of it.
Yeah, I think that's excellent input, because there are two things I'm hearing. You've got to keep that conversation going all the time. And the second thing is you've got to have the mechanisms for reporting. And I know that we will be dealing with hotlines and reporting at some stage during this year in our master classes, but those things are critical. Fatima.
And just on Jovita's mention of reporting, it's also the reporting by the ethics office. So you, as the custodian of ethics, your responsibility when you report upwards, when you report, whether you're reporting to the working group, whether you're reporting to COO, whether you're reporting to social ethics committee, is you raise strategic ethics risk. And you have to spot that limelight and say, if we, by doing this or not doing that, or these things, create a risk to the business. And it's your responsibility as the custodian of ethics to be able to do that. And because that also is what, when we talk ethical leadership, it's also about accountability, and it's also about it's taking that to that next level. So the reporting is the reporting of someone affected through the whistleblowing mechanism, and then it's the reporting by the ethics office around the strategic ethics risk as well.
Exactly. Very good answer. Thank you. I hope that that's helped you, Anonymous, and that you can take some encouragement from what's been discussed. And so we go into session 3, which is the review of the Code of Ethics. And we're looking at how, who, and what. Thanks, Fatima.
Okay, sure. So we recommend, if you look at the handbook, it recommends that the Code of Ethics should be reviewed against a legal practice, a leading practice standard. And ideally, in the process of drafting your code, you undertake in your mind a process of review already, because you're trying to understand what do we need to have, etc. So even before you publish a code, whether it's a second iteration or the first iteration, you need to have cast your eye over it and looked at it both from a content as well as a form perspective. Now, some organizations like to have a particular milestone, like they may say, in our organization, we have the habit or the practice that we review our policy documents every 3 years. Others may say, we may review it should something significant happen, or we may review it at such time. They may say something like, this code will be reviewed as determined by the ethics committee, or alternatively every 2 years. So some codes may have provisions like that. Some may not, but in the ethics committee charter, they may opt to when they're going to do it. Again, it's about speaking to your context. Some codes would say that the next time we do an ethics risk assessment is when we're going to do the review. The point is that the review has to be real. It has to make an impact, understanding what your constitution is, what your code is, and the impact that it has. So you give yourself that leeway to do it. Now, preferably, the review must be done by an objective person, because like we say, you can't mark your own homework. So if I'm the drafter, I'm not going to do the review because I'm biased. I'm not objective in my perception. So you want to get someone either internally who was not part of the drafting process, or externally an expert who would come in to be able to do the review. So sometimes, for example, as the Ethics Institute, we may get asked, if we know an organization, to come in and bring in an objective expert input from a review perspective. But you want that objectivity. And again, you don't want it to be a paper-based exercise. It needs to really be a true, genuine exercise that, that gives merit to the whole discussion around review. And review really is about what do we have, what has worked, what hasn't worked, where can we do better. Now, what we provide for you in the handbook is we provide some guidance around what to look for in the review aspects. And we also provide at the end of the handbook a template, or as one of the annexures, which is a guideline for how you would review. And that guideline is based on leading practice standards. So essentially, when we review, we make a distinction between form and content. So from a form perspective, and the form questions, a lot come from what we shared with you in our second session around what is important for you when you draft. So you need to, as the drafter, always bear this in mind, and you can almost go to the back and look at it even when you're drafting, so that you see the connection between the two, and there's a lot of resonance. So when someone is reviewing a code, what they want to know is it clear what is the purpose of the document? Is the document understandable? What is the tone, and is there a resonance between the tone and the purpose? Are they connecting? Are they saying the same thing? What is the format of the document? What is what we call the architecture or the structure of the document? Is it achieving its intended purpose? So all of those questions on the first set around form are a lot around the drafting. How is the document being developed and drafted, and does it meet its intended purpose? The latter part of the review questions then look at the practicality. So how accessible is it? How has the organization gone off and made it real? And is it meeting its intended audience? But also when you review it, you want to make sure that there is a logic in it, that it's coherent. It's not all over the place. There's some sort of structure to it, so that you put yourself in the seat of a reader. Is it clear? Is it simple to read? Easy to understand? Does it flow? If I'm not part of your organization, does it make sense to me? So the first element of review looks around the form. Then the second element of review looks around content. So from a content perspective, the question the reviewer would ask is it comprehensive? And from a comprehensiveness point of view, what you're looking to see is, does it address in one space, in one document, comprehensively all of the key areas that it needs to address, which links to your purpose? Because the last thing you want is a document that is doing lots of cross-referencing and is a long document that becomes difficult for people to navigate. And when you think about your code of ethics, it's always important from a review perspective that you keep that ethics management framework at the back of your mind. Because a key thing to developing the code of ethics is that the code of ethics comes after your ethics strategy. And your ethics strategy appreciates your risk and opportunities and gives you your vision. So from a review perspective, what you would look for is the code of ethics aligned with your ethics strategy? Now, when we talk about auxiliary content, generally what we mean is that there would be other things that are related to or support your code of ethics, like it may be policies or strategies, And does it take cognizance of those? Is it in sync with the broader regulatory universe within your organization? Are you perhaps making cross-referencing or something that people can understand it and make sense of it? They're not sitting and thinking, how does this fit in with that? They're able to see the bigger picture and understand that this is where this code fits in. It's not saying anything different to any other document that we have within the organization. So I encourage you to please look at the handbook, to use the resource that's been provided for you in the handbook, to perhaps take that template and make one of your own and try to use it both when you draft and also if you're commissioning a review or if you yourself are going to be conducting a review for another organization. Jupiter?
Yes, thanks, Fatima. In terms of I'm going to speak of two scenarios. I'm going to speak of the scenario where you are totally a Mozambican company, or you're totally independent and you have an independent code of ethics, and then the situation of most transnationals where there's a code that comes from group and then you localize it. So in terms of review of your own code, I think Fatima has covered very well. And I think one of the things that will feed you in terms of it's time to review it is the queries that you're now getting. If they're very disconnected to the document that you have, you will have a sensation that your document is already not responding to where you want to go, because it's not responding to your staff queries, not responding to the day-to-day, is not adaptable anymore to how you work. It's not serving its purpose anymore. So the awareness and the conversation that you keep on going will actually feed you the information in terms of when it's time to actually conduct a review. So my advice is that this review is done periodically. And when I say review, sometimes you will find out that you don't have to change a lot on the essence, but you will redo your relaunch, you'll do a relaunch and all of that in terms of creating again that buzz around it, in terms of we've looked into this and we've reviewed it and we've been working on it, and these are the changes that we've had this year. This is where we're coming from. This is where we are. In terms of sharing with the staff the journey. So review is very important in terms of that, of feeding to the people involved that are not on the day-to-day management of ethics. They are the subjects of it, but they're not on the day-to-day managing ethics per se on the day-to-day. They don't look at the reports. They don't look at the changes. So it's important that they have this reports periodically, and then at that time of reporting is a good time also to kind of do a quick review in terms of, is this still what we need to take us to the next level? Because remember when we were talking on the other sessions, you can have two types of codes. You can have a directional one. So maybe you have been working with a directional one, but there's been so much improvement in your culture that you need to lighten up on the rule and go more on the inspirational type of code. So all of those adjustments need to be made if you see that the maturity of ethics and the awareness is growing in your company. So that's one of the things I wanted to share for the ones that do the drafting from scratch. In terms of the localization, is more or less the same concept. Is from time to time you need to understand whether the definitions that you've used in terms of localizing are still applicable. If you need to update them, if you're having other risks, if you're having other opportunities, if you need to translate things in a different way. So this exercise happens at both situations, where you own the code of ethics or where you get it from a group perspective. So whenever you notice that you have new risks and new opportunities, because of all the awareness and the conversation that you keep on going, and these risks are so the risks and opportunities are so big that they need to be addressed or to be promoted in case of opportunities, then you do a quick review. It may not be a review of the whole code, but at least on those points, on those definitions, on the communications that are going to go related to that. So it's more of an adapting. So it's important that because it's a live document, it needs to adapt. It needs to, it's not stuck. You can't say we wrote this 2 years ago, so this is what we are. No, we wrote this 2 years ago with this objective. What is important is for you to always have your purpose. What was the purpose when we did this document? And that's what leads you. It's not exactly what's written, but what did we want to achieve? And this will tell you when what's written is not responding to what we wanted to achieve, then it's time to review, it's time to change. But Tim also said it's very important that this review and this change is done by somebody other than whoever's been implemented, because you're very involved, you're very marking your own work, and we are humans, we are subjective. We do not want to mark ourselves wrongly, because sometimes we may lose also focus of the fact that we did codes 2 years ago. And then when we look at it and it's already so disconnected, we may feel that we didn't do a good job 2 years ago. And then we become a bit harsh on ourselves, or we become protective of that document. So we need other eyes to look at it. We need other people to look at it, an expert that can look at it, look at the risks and opportunities that we have now, and kind of help us develop into the next level of the code that we have. So that's exactly what I wanted to share in relation to that.
Great, thank you so much. David's question was exactly that. How frequently do you review the Code of Ethics? And I would imagine that COVID has made quite a lot of an impact on organizations, so that they've had to review a number of their values and processes around operation, and specifically around IT issues and the security of information with remote work, for example. So yes, very valuable input. And David, yes, you review it as often as you need to. I don't think, if I'm right in what I've heard, is that there's no sort of set rule about how often you should do it, but as soon as you see that it's that there are new issues, that things are not working, that people are asking questions, and in fact that where processes are sort of sidelined, then it's very important. So with that, if there are no other questions, I just want to see what our timing is. We're a little bit early, so if you have some questions, please do raise your hand and we can give you the mic just so that you can share your question. Just if you do, would you please just introduce yourself without your camera if you don't mind, and then say who you are, and if you'd like to, of course, and which company you represent, and then ask the presenters your question. Just while we're on that fact, I wanted to just remind you also that the people that have managed to attend all 3 of these masterclasses will qualify to receive a certificate of attendance, and we will be sorting that out during next week, and you will receive your certificates next week. If there are any people who would like to ask a question, now's your opportunity. We'll give you that time now.
Barbara, so if I can maybe just jump in there very briefly. So
yes.
Folks, you're going to have to raise your hand, and then once you've raised your hand, I will up you to panelist, and then you can come in on the mic and say your say.
Is there anybody?
So we're looking for raised hands.
I see nothing at the moment. Yes, Fatima.
Yeah, no, you mentioned COVID, and I wanted to throw that in, maybe just pick it up. You know, one of the things that COVID has done is it actually has made employees really hold organizations accountable to their values. So if they say we're a caring, compassionate, we stand in our values to be a caring, compassionate employer. COVID has really held up the mirror to say, what does that mean in this context? You know, what does caring and compassionate mean? Because you can't be caring and compassionate and then give me contradictory signals about, you know, how I work or how I come out. So in the language of ethics, it's been really interesting to have what were values that were crafted at a particular point. And really, when we talk about values, it's about living our values. And when we get tested by a situation that's unforeseen, those values still stay. They transcend the circumstance. And what does that look like? And a lot of employers have had to really, you know, kind of step up, if you like, and live those values. It's come more easily to some than others, but really, you know, on that point that you were raising about COVID, it is just to share with the group that it is something that has many consequences or implications for businesses, one of which has really been about living our values. Exactly. You know, Jovita, if you want to add something there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think that it has had that effect also. And in a way, it has had the other effect also in terms of how engaged and compromised the staff was with the company, because it's a two-way street. Because if you say that you care all this time and then you're showing me that you don't care, my own motivation to continue working from home is very low. And then you have high levels of engagement of those people that were actually very connected and they know where they're going. Because it then becomes easier also to do the shifts, because if you had ethics as your paramount, there's an ethics of how we work. It's easy to translate that working from home. If there was none, the whole process of readaptation is quite difficult, because if I was used to working with so much control because somebody was there looking at me working all the time, and I worked because of that, because I had to be there those 8 hours, not because I knew where I was going, what was the objective. When I'm home, I'm lost. Right. So that had a lot of impact. Companies that had this disconnection between how we work and what we do struggled more than the ones that actually had this is what we want to achieve and how we want to achieve, because then people are able to work independently. And that's the strength of a good code of ethics and a good implementation. Institutionalizing your code of ethics is very important there, because you need to know that your staff does not need to be within your four walls to understand how and what they have to achieve.
No, that's an excellent point. And I think it provides a level of security, particularly for people who are not accustomed to working from home. And that is very important. I'm just thinking, while we're discussing, you know, the primary and secondary implementation, and then looking at the review, that in many ways, the ethics champion has got to be the least defensive person in the organization. They are the one who has to take quite a lot of criticism, quite a lot of knocking the processes, knocking all the other things, because people are quite outspoken when they disagree with something. And they quite often, unless it's the culture of the organization, quite often less comfortable with giving praise where it's due. But I suspect, though, that what it requires is an ethics officer or ethics champion who is a really good communicator, and someone who is not defensive about their work, but that has an approach that says, I can learn from you. We're learning together. This is something that we need to be in together. And I think that's an incredibly important value. Just in terms of where we go from here with the masterclasses, I know that we've asked you before, but we would very much value the input from our participants around the topics for the future. If you have pressing issues that you'd like us to deal with, please let us have those. We need to know what you're thinking. For those of you who have sent in those suggestions, thank you very much. We're very grateful. if you think there's value in providing an in-depth look at, let's say you have the worst case scenario with leadership that is quite anti-ethics, and you needing to implement something or to draft a code, and then, or otherwise you have middle management, you have leadership that is really supportive, but middle management that is resistant. Let us know if you think that that is something of value that we could assist you with in a practical way and provide really good benchmark guidelines to implementing your code of ethics and making sure that it works. If there are any other comments or questions, now's your time. We have a few minutes left. I don't have any additional information apart from the fact that we as the coalition will be looking at our strategy and our program for 2021 in the next 2 weeks. And we will be communicating that with you. And I can tell you we have some very exciting topics to talk about, and we have some very exciting people that are going to be participating in our masterclasses. So keep a lookout for your newsletter. And then just a final, very, very grateful thank you to Fatima and to Javita for 3 excellent sessions. I'm sure you've seen, there has been such good feedback on the practical input, very rational, very logical, helpful input that's been made on in these 3 masterclasses. And I want to just say, personally, I really have enjoyed working with you in the prep meetings and just listening to you both give such excellent input into these masterclasses.